For over 600 years, a triangular wooden structure stood at the crossroads of what is now London's Hyde Park Corner, serving as England's most notorious execution site. The Tyburn Gallows, known colloquially as the Tyburn Tree, witnessed the final moments of an estimated 50,000 souls between 1196 and 1783. This was not merely a place of death, it was theatre, spectacle, and England's most macabre form of public entertainment. The very mention of Tyburn sent shivers through the hearts of London's criminal underworld. Yet for the common citizens, execution days became festive occasions, drawing crowds of up to 100,000 spectators who would travel from across England to witness what they called Tyburn Fair. What transformed a simple crossroads into a symbol of terror that haunted the collective consciousness of a nation? The answer lies in the deliberate spectacle of suffering that defined medieval and early modern justice. The location itself carried symbolic weight. Positioned at the meeting point of ancient Roman roads, Tyburn represented the crossroads between civilization and barbarism. Archaeological evidence suggests the site had been used for executions since Saxon times, with mass graves containing hundreds of skeletons, many showing signs of violent death. The psychological impact extended throughout London and beyond, where children learned to fear its name before they could properly pronounce it. Foreign visitors to London invariably wrote about Tyburn in their travel journals, often expressing shock at both the brutality of the executions and the enthusiasm of the crowds. The economic impact of execution days was substantial, with entire industries built around serving the crowds, creating a morbid economy that made Tyburn executions as much about commerce as justice. Historical context and legal framework. The establishment of Tyburn as London's primary execution site occurred during the reign of Henry II, when the growing city needed a designated location for public executions outside its walls. The site, located at the convergence of three ancient roads, Watling Street, the road to Oxford, and Edgware Road, was strategically chosen for maximum visibility and accessibility. This decision reflected the medieval understanding that justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done, with the widest possible audience bearing witness to the consequences of transgressing royal law. Medieval England operated under the Bloody Code, as historians would later term England's penal laws. By 1815, over 200 offences carried the death penalty, including stealing sheep, cutting down trees, and associating with gypsies. This explosion in capital crimes meant that Tyburn's gallows rarely stood empty, with execution days occurring as frequently as 8 times per year during peak periods. The legal system operated on the principle that the king's peace must be maintained at any cost, with visible punishment preventing others from similar crimes. The procession from Newgate Prison to Tyburn became as ritualized as the execution itself. Condemned prisoners were loaded onto carts for the 3-mile journey through London's crowded streets, often stopping at taverns where they were encouraged to drink ale, a final mercy before facing their fate. This journey, known as the last mile, typically took 2 to 3 hours, with crowds lining the route to catch glimpses of the condemned. The legal proceedings that led to Tyburn were often rushed and unfair by modern standards. Many defendants faced trial without legal representation, with proceedings conducted entirely in Latin until 1731. Evidence was often circumstantial, and the presumption of innocence was not firmly established. Confessions extracted under torture were admissible in court, leading to numerous executions of individuals who may have been innocent. Class distinctions were rigidly maintained, even in death. Wealthy criminals could sometimes purchase the privilege of being hanged with silk ropes rather than hemp, or being executed earlier when crowds were smaller. Aristocrats convicted of treason might be granted the mercy of beheading rather than hanging, though this privilege was not always honored if public sentiment demanded a more degrading death. The architecture of death. The original Tyburn consisted of 2 vertical posts connected by a horizontal beam, a simple but effective design that could accommodate multiple simultaneous executions. By 1571, this evolved into the infamous triple tree, a triangular structure capable of hanging 24 people at once, with 8 victims suspended from each of its 3 sides. The engineering reflected centuries of experience in mass execution, with careful attention paid to weight distribution, rope angles, and visual impact. The Tyburn Gallows employed the short drop method, designed to maximize suffering rather than ensure quick death. Unlike later innovations that aimed for swift neck fracture, victims at Tyburn faced prolonged strangulation, a death that could take anywhere from 10 minutes to half an hour. The condemned were positioned on carts beneath the gallows, nooses placed around their necks, then the carts were driven away, leaving victims suspended by their necks alone. Without sufficient drop distance to break the spine, victims would thrash violently as they slowly asphyxiated, their faces turning purple as crowds below cheered or jeered. The triangular design meant that executions could be conducted with industrial efficiency. On busy execution days, the gallows resembled a grotesque chandelier of human bodies, swaying in the London wind as life slowly ebbed from each victim. Family members and friends were permitted to pull on the legs of the condemned to hasten death, an act called the last kindness, though it often prolonged agony as additional weight caused further strain without providing force necessary for quick death. The sight of children pulling on their parents' legs or spouses attempting to end their loved ones' suffering added layers of emotional brutality to the physical horror. The construction itself reflected centuries of refinement in public execution. The posts were made of seasoned oak, chosen for strength and weather resistance. The horizontal beams were calculated to support multiple bodies while providing optimal visibility. The triangular design ensured clear views from any position in the crowd. Maintenance was constant. Regular inspections prevented embarrassing collapses during executions. Weather conditions significantly affected outcomes. Rain-soaked ropes stretched under victims' weight, sometimes causing them to touch ground and prolonging agony. Winter executions were particularly brutal, as cold stiffened ropes and made them less likely to break cleanly. Summer brought different horrors, as heat and humidity increased the stench of death and accelerated decomposition of any bodies left hanging as warnings. Notorious criminals and their final moments. Claude Duval's execution in 1670 drew unprecedented crowds. The French gentleman highwayman had become legendary for his courteous robberies and alleged romantic conquests, maintaining composure even as the noose tightened. Witnesses reported that he joked with the crowd until his final breath, refusing the traditional blindfold and dying with what observers called aristocratic dignity. His reputation as a gallant robber who treated victims with courtesy had made him a folk hero among London's working classes. Captain William Kidd's execution in 1701 became one of Tyburn's most horrifying spectacles when the rope broke during his first hanging attempt. The Scottish privateer-turned-pirate had to endure the psychological torture of facing death twice in one day. Contemporary accounts describe him as trembling uncontrollably and weeping like a child during preparation for the second attempt, his earlier bravado completely shattered. The crowd, initially sympathetic, grew restless during the delay and began calling for his blood with increased fervor. Mary Blandy in 1752 highlighted the gender dynamics of Tyburn executions. Convicted of poisoning her father, she faced particular cruelty due to contemporary beliefs about women who committed violent crimes. As she mounted the scaffold, spectators pelted her with rotten fruit and animal waste, screaming accusations of witchcraft and unnatural behavior. The execution of women was always controversial, with debates about whether public hanging was too degrading for the fairer sex. Catholic priests during Tudor persecutions faced not just hanging, but drawing and quartering, a process that began while they were still conscious from partial hanging. Father Edmund Campion's screams in 1581 were reportedly heard over the roar of the crowd, his body dismembered before his eyes, as the ultimate expression of state-sanctioned religious terror. Jonathan Wild's execution in 1725 demonstrated the thin line between law enforcement and criminality in Georgian London. Wild had served as London's unofficial chief of police while simultaneously running the city's largest criminal organization. He faced a particularly hostile crowd that pelted him with stones throughout his final journey, highlighting the corruption that permeated all levels of London society. Jack Sheppard's execution in 1724 drew what may have been the largest crowd in Tyburn's history. The young thief had become famous for daring escapes from prison, including multiple breakouts from the supposedly escape-proof Newgate prison. His celebrity status attracted spectators from across Europe, with some paying enormous sums for premium viewing positions. Sheppard maintained his defiant attitude until the end, reportedly winking at admirers just moments before the cart was driven away. Elizabeth Brownrigg in 1767 revealed the particular horror reserved for those convicted of child abuse. Brownrigg, who had tortured and murdered her apprentices, faced perhaps the most violent crowd reaction in Tyburn's history. Spectators attempted to storm the gallows before her execution, and her body was pelted with stones both before and after death, reflecting contemporary attitudes toward crimes against children. The crowd's appetite for spectacle execution days revealed the darkest aspects of human nature, transforming ordinary citizens into a bloodthirsty mob hungry for entertainment. Wealthy London families would rent windows in nearby buildings for premium views, while enterprising vendors sold printed broadsheets detailing the crimes and last words of the condemned. The social stratification of the crowd mirrored London society itself, with the wealthy occupying elevated positions while the poor pressed forward in the pit below. Crowd behavior varied dramatically based on victim popularity or notoriety. Popular criminals like Robin Hood-type figures often received sympathetic treatment, with spectators offering final drinks and words of comfort. However, those convicted of particularly heinous crimes faced unprecedented brutality from the assembled masses. The crowd's judgment was swift and final, often differing significantly from the legal verdict. Children as young as 5 were brought to executions as part of their moral education, their parents believing that witnessing death would teach them consequences of criminal behavior. These young spectators often showed the same enthusiasm as adults, cheering and throwing objects at unpopular victims while their parents explained proceedings in graphic detail. The normalization of violence for these children raises disturbing questions about long-term psychological impact. The carnival atmosphere extended beyond the execution itself. Fortune tellers, pickpockets, prostitutes, and street performers worked the crowds, creating a bizarre juxtaposition of death and celebration. Some spectators placed bets on how long victims would struggle before dying, turning human suffering into gambling entertainment. Professional criminals at execution sites created ironic situations where those who might themselves face the gallows came to watch others die. The economic ecosystem around Tyburn executions was remarkably sophisticated. Entrepreneurs would arrive at dawn to secure prime positions for selling food, drink, and souvenirs. Temporary grandstands were erected for wealthy spectators, complete with cushions and refreshments. Programs detailing the lives and crimes of the condemned were sold for premium prices, often containing sensationalized accounts bearing little resemblance to reality. Religious elements within the crowd added complexity. Some spectators attended in Christian charity, offering prayers for the condemned and viewing executions as opportunities for spiritual reflection. Others brought vengeful religious fervor, seeing the deaths as righteous punishment for sin and calling for more severe suffering. Protestant spectators might heckle Catholic priests being executed, while Catholic observers could disrupt executions of Protestant ministers. international tourists began planning London stays to coincide with major executions by the 18th century. Foreign visitors would write detailed accounts for publication in their home countries, providing external perspectives on how the rest of Europe viewed English justice, often describing proceedings as barbaric spectacles revealing troubling aspects of English character. The Surgeons' Hall connection and medical horror. One of Tyburn's most macabre aspects was the legal arrangement allowing the company of surgeons to claim executed criminals' bodies for anatomical dissection. This practice, formalized in 1540, meant horror for many victims extended beyond death. Their bodies would be cut apart in the name of medical education, often while families watched helplessly. The law specifically designated that murderers' bodies should be either hanged in chains as public warnings or delivered to surgeons for dissection. The struggle between surgeons and family members for possession of corpses created additional chaos at execution sites. Violent confrontations erupted as surgeons' assistants attempted to seize bodies while relatives fought to reclaim their dead for proper burial. These resurrection battles sometimes resulted in additional deaths and injuries among the crowd, turning the area around the gallows into a war zone where the living fought over bodies of the dead. The anatomization process was deliberately designed to extend punishment beyond death. Bodies were dissected publicly, with paying spectators permitted to observe as organs were removed and examined. The sight of freshly executed criminals being systematically dismembered served as perhaps the ultimate deterrent, suggesting that even death could not end suffering. The anatomical theaters where these dissections took place became secondary venues for public entertainment. Some condemned criminals expressed greater fear of anatomization than execution itself, believing that dismemberment would prevent their resurrection on Judgment Day. This religious terror was deliberately exploited by authorities, who used the threat of anatomical dissection as leverage to extract confessions and cooperation from prisoners. The theological implications created additional psychological torture for the condemned. The medical community's demand for fresh corpses created a grisly market economy around Tyburn executions. Surgeons would bid against each other for rights to particularly interesting bodies, with factors such as age, physical condition, and cause of death affecting final price. Young, healthy criminals commanded premium prices, while older or diseased individuals might go unclaimed. Transportation of bodies from Tyburn to anatomical theaters became yet another public spectacle. Crowds would follow carts carrying fresh corpses, sometimes attempting to interfere with their delivery to surgeons. The sight of bodies being loaded onto carts while blood still dripped from their necks added another layer of horror to the already traumatic experience of witnessing executions. The scientific value of these dissections was often questionable, as anatomical knowledge available at the time was rudimentary. Many dissections were performed more for public entertainment than genuine medical education, with surgeons playing to their audiences rather than conducting serious scientific inquiry. The spectacle of cutting open human bodies often overshadowed any legitimate educational purpose. The psychological impact on anatomists themselves has been largely overlooked by historians, but contemporary accounts suggest many struggled with ethical implications of their work. Some surgeons reported nightmares and psychological disturbances after dissecting recently executed criminals' bodies, particularly when those bodies showed signs of life during initial dissection stages, a not uncommon occurrence given hanging's imprecise nature. Technical innovations and execution methods. Various improvements were made to the Tyburn execution process over the centuries, though these modifications often increased rather than decreased victim suffering. The introduction of the Tyburn jig, the violent dancing motion of victims as they slowly strangled, became so associated with the gallows that the phrase entered common English vocabulary. Executioners began studying these death throes, developing techniques to maximize their duration and intensity for crowd entertainment. The practice of turning off became increasingly ritualized, with specific protocols governing how carts should be driven away and at what speed to ensure optimal spectacle. Executioners discovered that sudden jerks produced more dramatic physical reactions from victims, leading to development of techniques designed to maximize visible suffering. The timing of cart departure became crucial, with experienced executioners coordinating multiple carts to create synchronized death throes. The evolution of rope technology specifically for executions represents one of Tyburn's more disturbing aspects. Different materials were tested to determine optimal combinations of strength and elasticity. Hemp ropes were eventually standardized, but their thickness and treatment varied depending on desired outcome. Some executioners would pre-stretch ropes to reduce elasticity, while others preferred ropes that would give slightly under victim weight, prolonging strangulation. Noose positioning became a science unto itself, with different knot placements producing varying effects on victim death throes. The traditional hangman's knot, designed to tighten progressively under weight, was modified and refined over centuries of use. Some executioners developed signature knot styles that became their trademarks, with crowds learning to recognize particular hangman's work by the specific way their victims died. Innovations in crowd control evolved alongside execution techniques. Barriers and rope lines were introduced to manage massive crowds gathering for popular executions. Guards armed with clubs and later firearms were stationed around gallows to prevent rescue attempts and maintain order. The development of scheduled execution times allowed authorities to better predict and manage crowd sizes. The introduction of printed programs and broadsheets represented early mass media centered around death. These publications contained biographical information about the condemned, details of their crimes, and often fabricated last words designed to maximize emotional impact on readers. The popularity spawned an entire industry of execution-related publishing. Development of viewing platforms and temporary seating arrangements turned Tyburn into a primitive amphitheater of death. Wooden stands were erected for wealthy spectators, complete with refreshment services and cushioned seating. The economic impact was substantial, with some entrepreneurs making their entire livelihood from execution day commerce. Medical innovations, particularly development of more sophisticated methods for determining death, had unexpected effects on Tyburn executions. As physicians became better at detecting signs of life, hanging duration was sometimes extended to ensure victims were truly dead before being cut down. This medical precision paradoxically increased suffering by preventing premature removal from gallows. Notable mass executions and their impact. The most horrifying aspect of Tyburn was its capacity for mass execution, with the record set on a single day in 1649 when 24 Jacobite rebels were hanged simultaneously. The sight of nearly 24 bodies swaying from the triple tree created what contemporary witnesses described as a forest of the dead, with victims' death throes creating a symphony of suffering that lasted over an hour. The logistics required careful choreography and precise timing to ensure maximum spectacle impact. The mass execution of Jacobite rebels represented more than criminal justice. It was a political statement about consequences of challenging royal authority. Each condemned man had been carefully selected to represent different aspects of the rebellion, from common soldiers to aristocratic leaders. Their simultaneous execution demonstrated that no level of society was immune from royal justice when it came to treason. The execution of the Cato Street conspirators in 1820 marked one of the last great spectacles at Tyburn before its abolition. These men, convicted of plotting to assassinate the entire British cabinet, faced not just hanging, but posthumous beheading. A revival of medieval practices that shocked even the execution-hardened London crowd. The decision to add beheading reflected government desire to send unmistakable messages about political terrorism consequences. The gunpowder plot executions of 1606 demonstrated Tyburn's capacity for choreographed political theatre. Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators were not simply executed, they were systematically tortured before death, with each stage of suffering designed to reinforce specific messages about religious loyalty and political obedience. The crowd's reaction to these executions differed notably from typical criminal cases, with religious and political divisions evident in different sections. The logistics of mass executions revealed the industrial scale of Tyburn's operation. Multiple carts were required to transport the condemned, while additional executioners and assistants managed complex choreography of simultaneous death. The psychological impact on victims of watching companions die first or simultaneously added layers of terror. Contemporary accounts describe how some condemned men would lose consciousness from fear before nooses were even placed around their necks. Crowd control during mass executions became a significant challenge, with authorities deploying armed guards to prevent riots or rescue attempts. The sight of dozens of bodies hanging from a single structure created powerful imagery that inspired numerous artistic and literary works, cementing Tyburn's place in cultural consciousness. The visual impact was deliberately calculated to overwhelm spectators and create lasting psychological impressions. The economic impact of mass executions was enormous, with some events drawing crowds larger than any other public gathering in London's history. Entire industries mobilized to serve these crowds, from food vendors to transportation services. The scale of commerce surrounding major mass executions demonstrated how thoroughly death had become integrated into London's economic life. International attention garnered by mass executions contributed to England's reputation for barbaric justice throughout Europe. Foreign diplomats and visitors would specifically time their London stays to witness major executions, often writing detailed accounts published across the continent. These external perspectives helped shape international opinion about English civilization and contributed to growing pressure for execution system reform. Social class and execution hierarchy. The rigid class distinctions of Georgian England extended even to the gallows, where social status could determine not only execution method, but the dignity afforded to victims in their final moments. Aristocrats convicted of treason typically faced beheading rather than hanging, though this privilege was not always honored when public sentiment demanded more degrading death. The distinction between gentlemen's deaths and common hanging reflected broader social attitudes about different classes' inherent worth. Wealthy criminals could sometimes purchase accommodations that made their final hours more bearable. Superior meals, private cells, and even professional mourners' services were available to those who could afford them. Some condemned aristocrats were permitted to wear their finest clothes to the scaffold, maintaining social dignity even in death. The contrast between these privileged executions and brutal treatment afforded to common criminals highlighted class distinctions, persistence even facing ultimate punishment. The concept of dying well became particularly important for upper-class victims who were expected to maintain composure and dignity throughout the execution process. Contemporary accounts often praised aristocratic criminals who faced death with courage and style, while condemning those who broke down or showed fear. This emphasis on performative dignity turned executions into contests of character as much as displays of justice. The treatment of clergy represented a special category within the execution hierarchy. Priests and other religious figures were often afforded particular ceremonies and rituals, regardless of their crimes. However, during periods of religious persecution, these same privileges could be withdrawn as additional punishment. The execution of Catholic priests during the Tudor period involved deliberate humiliation, designed to strip away religious authority along with their lives. Women faced unique challenges and accommodations within the execution system. The concept of feminine modesty meant special arrangements were often made to preserve women's dignity during hanging, including provision of longer dresses to prevent indecent exposure, and sometimes the option of being executed at dawn to avoid the largest crowds. However, women convicted of particularly heinous crimes, especially those involving violence or sexuality, often faced more brutal treatment than their male counterparts. The children of condemned criminals occupied a particularly tragic position within the class hierarchy of execution. Offspring of aristocratic criminals might be provided for by distant relatives or charitable organizations, while children of common criminals often faced destitution and social ostracism. The sight of children watching their parents die became one of the most emotionally charged aspects of Tyburn executions. Foreign nationals faced additional complications based on their country of origin and current state of international relations. French criminals during periods of war with France might face particularly hostile crowds, while those from allied nations could sometimes expect more sympathetic treatment. Diplomatic considerations occasionally influenced execution procedures, though English law sovereignty was rarely compromised for foreign sensibilities. The emerging merchant class occupied an ambiguous position within the execution hierarchy. Wealthy traders and businessmen lacked traditional aristocracy privileges, but could afford many accommodations available to the upper classes. Their executions often drew particular attention from crowds curious about crimes that could bring down apparently successful and respectable citizens. The role of religion and spiritual preparation. The involvement of religious authorities in the execution process added layers of complexity to what might otherwise have been straightforward judicial killings. The Church of England provided chaplains who would accompany condemned prisoners on their final journey, offering last rites and encouraging public confessions that served both spiritual and propaganda purposes. These religious officials occupied delicate positions, seeking to provide genuine spiritual comfort while also reinforcing the moral authority of the state. The practice of public confession became a central ritual of Tyburn executions, with condemned criminals expected to acknowledge their crimes and express repentance before facing death. These confessions were often carefully rehearsed and edited to serve political and moral purposes beyond simple admission of guilt. The failure to confess publicly was seen as additional evidence of moral corruption and often resulted in harsher treatment from both authorities and crowds. Different religious denominations faced varying treatment at Tyburn, depending on the political climate of the time. Catholic priests during periods of Protestant persecution were often denied the comfort of their own religious rites, while Protestant dissenters during Catholic periods faced similar discrimination. The religious identity of the condemned could dramatically affect crowd reaction and the dignity afforded to their final moments. The theological implications of execution created complex moral questions for religious authorities. The taking of life, even by legal authority, raised questions about divine justice and human mercy that were never fully resolved. Some clergy refused to participate in executions on moral grounds, while others argued that their presence was essential to ensure salvation of condemned souls. The practice of selling indulgences and offering spiritual absolution for payment created additional moral complications around Tyburn executions. Wealthy criminals could sometimes purchase religious services unavailable to their poorer counterparts, raising questions about equality of divine justice and corruption of religious authority. The presence of different religious groups in the crowd often led to theological debates and sometimes violent conflicts. Protestant spectators might heckle Catholic priests being executed, while Catholic observers could disrupt executions of Protestant ministers. These religious tensions added another layer of unpredictability to execution proceedings. The development of execution sermons as a literary genre reflected the complex relationship between religion and capital punishment. These sermons, often published after major executions, attempted to extract moral lessons from criminals' deaths while justifying harsh penalties imposed by secular authority. The quality and theological sophistication of these works varied widely, but their popularity demonstrated public appetite for religious interpretation of the execution spectacle. The question of salvation for executed criminals became a matter of intense theological debate. Some argued that the extremity of their punishment indicated divine rejection, while others maintained that genuine repentance could ensure salvation even for the most heinous criminals. This debate played out publicly through the condemned criminals themselves, whose final words and behavior were scrutinized for signs of divine grace or damnation. International perspectives and comparisons. Foreign visitors to London invariably wrote about Tyburn in their travel journals, often expressing shock at both execution brutality and crowd enthusiasm. These accounts provide valuable insight into how other cultures perceived English justice, often describing proceedings as barbaric spectacles that revealed the true nature of English civilization beneath its veneer of refinement. Continental European observers, accustomed to their own forms of public punishment, nonetheless found something uniquely disturbing about the scale and commercialization of English executions. French commentators, despite their own history of public executions, often criticized the carnival atmosphere surrounding Tyburn deaths. They noted the absence of solemnity that characterized French executions, where crowds were expected to maintain respectful silence during proceedings. The English transformation of execution into entertainment struck many French observers as evidence of moral corruption within English society. German visitors frequently compared Tyburn unfavorably to their own execution methods, which they claimed were more efficient and humane. The German preference for beheading over hanging was presented as evidence of superior civilization, though this ignored the fact that German executions could be equally brutal and public. The cultural exchange of execution techniques between European nations revealed how each society justified its own methods while condemning those of others. Italian observers, particularly those from papal territories, focused on religious aspects of Tyburn executions. They criticized the Protestant approach to preparing condemned souls for death, arguing that the absence of Catholic sacraments doomed executed criminals to eternal damnation. These theological criticisms reflected broader religious conflicts between Protestant England and Catholic Europe. Spanish accounts of Tyburn often drew comparisons to their own Inquisition executions, arguing that Spanish auto de fe ceremonies were more dignified and spiritually meaningful than English hangings. The Spanish emphasis on religious purification through death contrasted sharply with the English focus on secular justice and public deterrence. American colonial observers, particularly those from Puritan communities, expressed mixed reactions to Tyburn executions. While they approved of harsh punishment for criminals, many found the celebratory atmosphere surrounding English executions to be morally corrupting. The American preference for more solemn execution ceremonies reflected different attitudes toward the relationship between justice and entertainment. Dutch visitors, coming from a society with relatively liberal attitudes toward criminal justice, often expressed horror at the severity and frequency of English executions. The Dutch emphasis on rehabilitation rather than punishment led to particularly critical assessments of the Tyburn system and its apparent failure to reduce crime rates. Scandinavian observers noted the contrast between English execution practices and their own traditions of community-based justice. The impersonal nature of Tyburn executions, where victims often died among strangers, struck Nordic visitors as particularly inhumane compared to their own practices of involving entire communities in judicial proceedings. The end of an era and abolition movement. By the late 18th century, changing attitudes toward public execution began to challenge Tyburn's role in English justice. Enlightenment thinking, combined with concerns about the corrupting influence of execution spectacles on public morality, led to calls for reform of the capital punishment system. The growing influence of humanitarian philosophy and emerging concepts of human rights created intellectual pressure for more humane approaches to criminal justice. The writings of reformers like Cesare Beccaria, whose On Crimes and Punishments challenged the entire foundation of capital punishment, began to influence English intellectual discourse. Beccaria's argument that certainty of punishment was more effective than its severity directly contradicted the logic underlying Tyburn's spectacular brutality. His work provided intellectual ammunition for those seeking to reform England's harsh penal code. Economic arguments against public execution gained traction as London's commercial interests began to view execution days as disruptive to business. The massive crowds that gathered for Tyburn executions effectively shut down large sections of the city, preventing normal commercial activity and creating security concerns for property owners. The cost of maintaining order during execution days also placed significant strain on municipal resources. Religious opposition to public execution grew stronger as evangelical movements emphasized the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation for even the most hardened criminals. The Methodist revival, led by figures like John Wesley, challenged the assumption that public execution served moral education, arguing instead that it corrupted both spectators and society as a whole. This religious critique provided moral authority for reform movements. The influence of prison reformers like John Howard cannot be understated in the movement to end public execution. Howard's investigations into English prisons revealed appalling conditions that often drove prisoners to crime, challenging the simplistic notion that criminals were inherently evil beings deserving of death. His work suggested that crime was often a product of social conditions rather than moral corruption. The development of alternative punishment theories, particularly the concept of imprisonment as rehabilitation, provided practical alternatives to execution for many crimes. The construction of modern prisons designed for long-term incarceration offered judges sentencing options that could protect society without resorting to death. This expansion of sentencing alternatives made wholesale use of capital punishment seem both unnecessary and wasteful of human potential. The last execution at Tyburn took place on November 7, 1783, when John Austin, a highwayman, became the final victim of the infamous gallows. His death marked the end of nearly 6 centuries of public execution at the site, though the practice continued at Newgate Prison until 1868. Austin's execution drew a smaller crowd than many previous events, reflecting changing public attitudes toward the spectacle of death. The demolition of the Triple Tree in 1783 drew surprisingly large crowds, with many London residents coming to witness the end of an institution that had defined their city's relationship with crime and punishment for generations. Pieces of the gallows were sold as souvenirs, with the wood reportedly fashioned into everything from walking sticks to furniture. Physical evidence and archaeological discoveries. Modern archaeological investigations of the Tyburn site have revealed disturbing evidence of the scale and brutality of executions that took place there over 6 centuries. Excavations conducted during construction projects uncovered mass graves containing hundreds of human remains, many showing clear signs of violent death. The condition of these skeletal remains provides concrete evidence of the suffering endured by Tyburn's victims. Forensic analysis of recovered skulls has revealed fractures consistent with hanging, though many also show evidence of blunt force trauma that likely occurred after death, when bodies were pelted with stones by hostile crowds. The discovery of remains with hands bound behind their backs confirms historical accounts of how prisoners were prepared for execution, while the presence of metal fragments suggests that some victims were weighed down to ensure death. The preservation conditions at Tyburn were generally poor due to London's clay soil and high water table, but enough organic material has survived to provide insights into the health and living conditions of executed criminals. Many skeletons show signs of malnutrition and disease, supporting historical accounts that suggested most of Tyburn's victims came from London's poorest classes. Carbon dating of recovered remains has allowed archaeologists to correlate specific burials with documented execution events, providing scientific confirmation of historical records. The distribution of remains across the site reveals the evolution of burial practices over time, with earlier periods showing more organized interment, while later periods demonstrate increasingly haphazard disposal of bodies. The discovery of children's remains at the site provides tragic confirmation of historical accounts describing the execution of juvenile criminals. English law permitted the execution of children as young as 7 for certain crimes, and archaeological evidence suggests that this brutal practice was indeed carried out. Artifacts recovered from the site include fragments of rope, metal buckles from restraints, and personal effects that were buried with the dead. These physical remnants provide tangible connections to individual victims whose names may never be known, but whose suffering is documented in the archaeological record. The soil chemistry at Tyburn shows elevated levels of heavy metals and other compounds consistent with the decomposition of large numbers of human bodies over extended periods. This chemical signature provides additional evidence of the site's use as a mass execution ground and helps archaeologists identify areas where the most intensive burial activity occurred.